Hi, welcome to the OrgDev podcast. Bias costs businesses billions in lost productivity and turnover every year, but its impact is just as damaging on an organisation and individual level. From unfair decisions in hiring and promotions to everyday team interactions, unchecked bias can lower morale, reduce engagement and limit innovation. In this episode, we explore how recognising and addressing bias can transform not only your organisation's bottom line, but also the daily experiences of your people. Join us as we invite the very compelling and insightful Chris Garrison to share her expertise on how to create fairer, more inclusive workplaces where everyone thrives. Now, Chris is the founder and director of CultureGen, an organisational consultancy that helps create high-performance workplaces. Chris works with clients to identify cultural challenges that are impacting individual and business performance and provides solutions based on theories of change and other evidence-based methodologies. Now, Danny, you first came across Chris when she was Director and Chief Problem Solver for APS Intelligence, didn't you?
I did, absolutely.
So APS is a psychological and strategic consultancy where you worked alongside the remarkable founder, John Amici, didn't you?
I'm privileged to call a very dear friend as well. So
brilliant. And we'll look forward to really exploring your work there as well. And from the first time that Danny saw Chris, she was really impressed with the way she came across and really engaging insights. And Chris's fascinating career, which has involved working on Wall Street as a salesperson and a consultant turned marketeer, retail and consumer educator, public speaker, and now organisational consultant, means she brings a richness to her work, which makes her a brilliant guest for the OrgDev podcast. So welcome, Chris. It's lovely to have you join us.
My pleasure to be here with both of you.
So just to kick us off, just tell us a bit more about the work that you're doing.
So the elevator pitch answer to that question is that I look at the kinds of behaviors that people are experiencing in the workplace and how that impacts their ability to perform well at their jobs. And I typically focus on people in the most senior leadership positions only because they have a disproportionate responsibility in sort of creating the tone and the understanding of what an organization's culture is. But ultimately, everything that I do has a cascade effect. It could apply equally to the most junior person in an organization as well as to a board chair or a CEO or anybody in the C-suite. But ultimately, it's, what are the barriers that get in the way of people being able to perform at their best? And what can we do to change those behaviors so that people are just able to have a more optimal workplace experience?
Are there particular kind of types of organisation sizes, sectors that you work in, or is it a good mix?
The good news is that what I do is pretty industry agnostic. There isn't one area that what I do, works for. And that's mostly because behaviors are universal experiences. If somebody is experiencing a behavior in Southeast Asia that is causing them to not perform as well as they'd like to, it's likely that the exact same behavior is being experienced by somebody in another region in North America or in Europe, and it's having the exact same impact. So I don't have to be an expert in any one specific industry sector in order to do what I do, because my expertise is in the stuff that is impacting people in their day-to-day lives at work.
And are there common themes that you see in the organisations you're working with, common behaviours that are kind of...
So many.
Yeah.
Where to start? I'd say the biggest ones are that there is still a significant disconnect in the minds of a lot of senior leaders in terms of what is the lived experience that people are having in an organization. And so they rely pretty heavily on things like engagement surveys or pulse surveys to illuminate for them what that experience is. But unfortunately, they tend to focus on the positive outcomes of those surveys. And for me, the interesting story is in who's answering in the negative. If 30% of your people are saying that they're feeling disengaged, why? Who are they? Where are they? What is it that's creating that sense of disengagement for them? And what I think is happening is that there are still a lot of leaders who are sort of bolstered by 70% of our people are saying that they're having a great time. And then so they sort of ignore what's happening with the 30%. And that's pretty consistent in most organizations that I work in, where they just, and it isn't because they're bad people and they're not paying attention. It's more a function of the more senior you become, the more disconnected you become from the largest number of people within the organization. And so you're relying on other channels of information to help you understand what that experience is because you're not immersed in it yourself. At the same time, that's a really easy gap to close. What it requires is effort on the part of people in senior leadership positions to really understand what that gap is and what's driving it. And then they have to be the ones who are the most vocal about changing the experience for everybody in the organization. So that's kind of the first consistency that I see. The second consistency that I see is that many people in management positions get promoted into those roles because of their technical skill and capability. And that is commendable. And there's lots of people who are amazing and technically skilled at their jobs. That is not the same thing as leadership. And so they get thrust into these positions where now they're given these responsibilities over people and they have a team of direct reports, but they're not really people who have come through any kind of leadership development training or even had the basic amount of help about what do I do to shift from being this technical expert to now all of a sudden being responsible for managing a team. And as a result of that, it's where a lot of performance suffers because people wind up reporting to somebody who was just their peer yesterday. And now all of a sudden this person is overseeing me, but I know because they were my peer that they've never done any leadership development stuff. And so it erodes a lot of the good things that often are created in teams that have good collaboration because you have this absence of people leadership capability, especially in first-time managers or middle managers. And when you look at data in things like those engagement surveys that I mentioned earlier, a lot of times you're going to see that there is an insufficiency in that leadership capability in people in management positions that is causing that sense of disengagement to happen in the first place. And again, that is a pretty, if I'm doing a cultural assessment where I'm actually assessing the lived experience of people, it's a guarantee. And I will tell whoever my stakeholders are, one of the things that's going to emerge from this data is that there is an insufficient leadership capability within management populations. Happens every single time. And then I think the third consistency is there's just not enough psychological safety in workplaces. And this perhaps should have been the first thing that I said, but I didn't write a script for myself for this, so just kind of riffing here. Psychological safety as an academic concept has been around since the 1990s. So we've known about it for a really long time, but it's kind of only starting to get some traction in organizations. And of course, what's happening politically in the US means that who knows what's going to happen with that traction. It might just grind to a halt. But the problem is that there's still a fundamental misunderstanding of what psychological safety is. And people think because it has the word psychology in it, that it's about mental well-being or something along those lines. And it isn't that. It is entirely about the kind of environment that exists in an organization and the behaviors that are expected and the behaviors that are not tolerated. And all of this is for the purpose of driving performance and innovation and growth and complex problem solving and every other metric that you want to have as a successful business. But because there's this misunderstanding of what it means it's not embedded in an organization the way that it should be. And so people aren't experiencing the value that psychological safety brings in terms of their performance. There is a defined set of behaviors that exist in psychologically safe organizations. We have a standard way of measuring the presence or absence of psychological safety in an organization, and yet it only exists in pockets when it's supposed to mean that if you work in a large organization that has multiple locations and you travel from the London office to an office in Berlin, that you should automatically know that the moment that you set foot in that office, that you are walking into the same psychologically safe environment as the office that you came from in London. And that doesn't mean that you aren't going to experience challenge or difficulty or have setbacks or be held accountable for things. And so this part of this element of not having enough psychological safety or understanding what psychological safety is that it's allowed a number of myths to crop up about what it actually means. Like, you can't give me challenging feedback because that makes me feel psychologically unsafe. It means that there's an absence of accountability. It means that there are no standards. It means that we can't have difficult conversations. And you can see from that short list of myths that if people believe that that's what it is, how that actually can hinder the performance of teams and individuals and organizations as a whole. So I think those are the three big consistencies that I see. There's others, but I think in every organization that I go into, those are the three that I almost not almost, I always come across those three elements in some degree or another. And the good news is that all of them are fairly easy to overcome if the ambition is there, which is perhaps the fourth consistency, which is there isn't always that ambition.
Which is a question I was going to ask. So psychological safety may be aside because that's more new, as it's a relatively newer concept for some. But things like the quality of leadership and, your team's being engaged and having a positive, those things have been around forever. They've been perennial issues.
Yeah.
What is it? Why aren't organisations getting it? Why are they still lagging and not investing and doing the work?
I think it's a difference between rhetoric and action. I think it's easy for people to say we want to have engaged employees. And that's, they often call them employees instead of colleagues. And so even the language that we use when we talk about these things can have an impact. And again, I think it goes back to what I said earlier about when we do an engagement survey, more than likely the majority of people in an organization are going to say that they are experiencing some degree of engagement. But there's a difference between being engaged and thriving. You can feel a sense of engagement at work, and some of that could be intrinsic motivation. It's because you really like the job that you are doing. But that doesn't mean that you're thriving at work. Because if you have a manager who every time somebody makes a mistake, they just unleash hellfire on the team, then that means that there's going to be an element of fear that exists that's going to have an impact on your ability to really thrive. You can still be engaged because you can put your head down, but are you really thriving? And so I think when people look historically at, yes, we want to have people who are engaged, we want to have high performance in teams, you still have to look at a granular level to find those leaders that were really creating the kind of stuff that from an academic perspective, we didn't put a name on until years or decades later. We didn't really understand the mechanisms of bias until Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky did their research starting in the late 60s and early 70s. And then the publication of Thinking Fast and Slow was really groundbreaking in helping us understand how bias works. But it's always existed. And so we've always had these things around us. When you think about things from an organizational psychology or a sociology standpoint, we didn't have a way to understand or to name the kinds of experiences that people were having. And so we just said, we want people to feel engaged, but didn't necessarily have the understanding of, well, what is required in order for that engagement to happen? What is required to help people feel belonging? And then how does that actually translate into their ability to be great at their jobs? And of course, we've come from, I think one of the big challenges, this is completely unrelated to what you've asked in terms of the direct question, but I think there's a link here, which is that when you look at people who are my age, and I'm in my early 50s now, and people who are older, so people who are the most senior leaders in organizations from an age demographic perspective, they came through leadership that was very, very different to what people expect of leaders in organizations today. And so they didn't have the best role models to understand the kinds of behaviors that were helping them or hindering them from being great. And because they didn't have these role models, what I think is interesting about this cohort of leaders is that they're in this position now where they don't have a frame of reference for the behaviors that people wanted. But everybody who's more junior than them is saying, we want inclusive leaders. We want leaders who create the kind of culture where we can thrive. We want to enable innovation. We want to have collaboration. We want to have creative outlets for our work. And they're like, whoa, how do you do that? Because every boss I ever had skewed towards authoritarianism. And I wasn't allowed to make mistakes. And I just had to keep my head down. And I just had to push through it. And I had to be resilient, which is a totally dysfunctional use of the term resilience, by the way. And so they're the ones that are trying to create this environment that is expected. But at the same time, all they've ever heard was, you better get this right or else. Oh, and by the way, we want you to feel engaged at the same time. So you're right that all of this has been around. That none of the stuff that I talk about in terms of, well, that behavior is going to enable somebody, and that behavior is going to hold somebody back. That has always existed as long as we've had bosses and workplaces and teams of people. Well, I think the advantage that we have now is that we have a much better understanding of, well, why does engagement matter? Why does a sense of belonging matter? Why does inclusion matter? Why is cognitive diversity absolutely essential for coming up with new solutions to complex problems. And at the same time, we still have this layer of weaponized ignorance where people are like, you gotta sell me on this. You gotta tell me why this stuff matters, which absolutely does my head in.
Weaponized ignorance. I love that. Can we put that in the OrgDev dictionary? That's okay. Brilliant terms we've heard. That's in the top 5 without a doubt. There's so many things you've just raised there. So just get my knife and fork, get stuck into.
I know I said a lot. I'm really sorry.
No, it's
really good stuff.
This is all really compelling stuff. And I guess just to roll back to one of the first things you said, which is when now things like the engagement surveys are done, and the engagement survey isn't an end in itself, as it yet often it's seen as that. And like an example that we had recently where, they shared their engagement data with us, a sort of a quite well-known body, and the data just spoke for itself. It was shocking. It was, if you had that many customers that were that unhappy, people's heads would start to roll. And yet this team sort of convinced them between themselves that it was okay and weren't willing to do it. Obviously, there's a role of bias that happens in here. So what are some of those things that happen that we're all kind of looking at the data, but we're choosing to be willfully blind about these things?
So there's 186 documented kinds of bias that we know about. And so many of them come down to some sort of core ideas. And one of those core ideas is that anything that is in front of us that presents us with the idea that somehow we might be wrong, or we might be bad people, or we might not be doing it right, automatically throws up a defense system, which we most commonly associate with the fight or flight response. And it is that. It's just not the kind that makes us feel like we have to run away from something. It's the kind that makes us feel like we have to self-preserve. And so unless you are able to recognize that this data, in your example, is not telling me that I'm getting it all wrong and that I'm a horrible person, that I'm a bad leader, that only then can you really start to look at what is the story that the data is telling. If your interpretation of that data is, ooh, let's just ignore the bad stuff over here and focus on the good stuff, it's probably because this bias, this sense of self-preservation is kicking in that makes you want to ignore anything that you see as a personal threat. And in this case, the personal threat that we're talking about is some aspect of your identity or your sense of self and sense of accomplishment. So I can absolutely see how people would just be like, oh, here's the carpet. Let's just shove that right under there and pretend it doesn't exist. And if we're lucky, those people will go away. And so there's this dissonance, right? So that's exactly what cognitive dissonance is. It's the understanding that there is a discomfort, but a complete willingness to overlook that discomfort. It's two completely opposing ideas. There is trouble happening here that we need to fix. I'm the one most responsible for fixing it, but it makes me uncomfortable to think about what is required or how it got that way. So I'm just going to ignore it and pretend everything is okay. And so that's, cognitive dissonance is a specific bias, but ultimately it's any one of a number of different things that all come down to the same principle, which is I've got to protect myself and the perception that people have of me, and in this case, my intellectual capability and my leadership.
It's a challenging thing to present almost, isn't it? And often things like engagement surveys sit with HR, and HR are the ones that have to present. How do you sort of make it, you can never make things make it safe enough to present data like that, where people can actually feel safe enough to start looking into it and maybe understanding that their ego and their identity isn't at stake here?
Yeah. When I do it, I just simply say that. I say, listen, I have to present some hard truths to you. And before I do that, it's really important that you understand that this is not a condemnation of you as a person or everything that you have done in your role in this organization. But I believe that you are people who are committed to improving the experience they're having. And the only way we can do that is to understand the experience that they're having now. And here's what's in it for you. And the moment that you couch things in terms of how are you going to benefit from whatever it is that I'm going to tell you, then suddenly it makes the difficult pill slightly easier to swallow. But the worst possible thing is to try and sugarcoat it. You just can't. You have to, the only way past is through is one of those phrases that applies in this situation. And at the same time, I mentioned earlier that one of the consistencies that I see is about the ambition piece, and the organizations that I think are absolutely crushing it when it comes to delivering on their cultural ambition are the ones that are willing to sit there and push through the pain of the data that is presenting this picture that some people are having an unfair experience in an organization. And the ones who are the least interested in making any of those changes are the ones who are the most resistant. I actually, when I was working with John, we did a big assessment for a very large, well-known organization on a global scale. And the chief people officer wanted to argue with me about the statistical validity of the data itself, to the point where he even said, I've got a team of data scientists here. If you hand over the raw data, I bet we would come up with very different results. And I'm like, no. Number one, we're not handing you the raw data. And number two, shouldn't you be more upset about the experience that we're telling you than the statistical reliability of the data itself, which we've already shown you to be incredibly statistically reliable? And so that one conversation said everything that I needed to know. And that came from the chief people officer. So that was his defense mechanism throwing up, because he's the one who's probably under the most pressure to create an organizational culture that people can thrive in. And here I am presenting him with this evidence that suggests that there is a significant number of people in the business who are, within 6 months of trying to find another job because that's how miserable they are. And so he didn't like hearing that. And it's not that I went in guns blazing and said, you're doing a terrible job. It's, here's the picture that the data is telling us so far. And that picture is that you've got pockets of really great things happening, but this particular group of people is having a real difficult time. And I can tell you lots of things about who they are, where they work, what role they're in, how senior they are, how many times they've gone for a promotion, how many times they've been promoted, what their experience is with their manager, and any one of a number of different variables. And all he wanted to do was argue with me about the reliability of the data.
I think it's something really interesting what you said also about the fact that the chief people officer in that scenario, the pressure he was feeling, the culture for the organisation's culture. And so often we'll talk to HR professionals who feel like the culture sits with them, which is flawed in my view. It's not the responsibility of the HR team, even if it's called the people and culture team.
That's a function of the weaponized ignorance in my mind, though, because if I am the CEO of an organization, then I have the most visible profile and I have huge amounts of pressure. I'm the face of the company. And if I say, we're committed to this, we're committed to creating a culture where people can perform at their best because we know how vital that is for our performance as an organization, but then turns around and says, okay, HR, it's over to you. I just said that on national television. Go. And they separate themselves from driving that, then it has a limited chance of success. It's not that it can't succeed, but one of the things that I've learned so many important things from John Amaechi, but one of them was, if you have people in the most senior positions in an organization who are willing to hand off responsibility for driving organizational culture to somebody else, then that sends a massive dog whistle that who we say we are here does not align with the lived experience that we actually want people to have. And the moment you have that disconnect between who we say we are here and how people actually experience the business, that is the thing that leads to all the stuff that we heard about, the Great Resignation, which is more accurately described as the Great Rejection. The number of people who will come into an organization and not stay through their probation period because they're like, well, this is not the picture that was created for me when I interviewed. Churn. And it's a mistake for people to think that the only ones who are leaving organizations are younger people or more junior people or low performers. They're not. There's incredibly capable, talented, high potential individuals who are looking at to find a place that aligns with their personal values and doesn't expect them to just turn into an automaton and have no feelings and no empathy. And that's the pathway to burnout. And we have really good science behind what causes burnout. And it's a lot right now. There's so many people experiencing it. It's an alarming situation.
And we touched on your career in the introduction, but also you sort of made mention of your work with John Amaechi. What was your journey into your role as founder of Culture Gen?
This might ruin my credibility. So I wanted to be a pediatrician that specialized in pediatric sports medicine because I played sports my most of my life and found that there was a gap in the market. And this happened when I was, I don't know, maybe like 11 or 12 years old, because I had a pediatrician, but I was playing sports. I had sports injuries, and there was nobody that specialized in pediatric sports injuries. And so that was how I started, right? That I was going to do that, and graduated from university and was pretty burned out on the just the intensity of being a pre-med major in university. So I wanted to defer going to medical school. And so I went to work at a law firm that specialized in medical malpractice. And I was doing medical research on malpractice cases, which was nice. And then I wound up at Citibank, because you can see the clearly linear track that put me on, because I still was not quite ready to go to medical school. And then basically through one of those life-changing severe end to a relationship, I wound up having to go back to the East Coast of the U.S. where I was from and basically start my life over, and wound up working in a bike store, because I was really into riding my bike. And that store, it was in Princeton, New Jersey, which was very near to one of the offices of Bloomberg. And so a lot of the customers in the store were people that worked at Bloomberg. And somebody said, why don't you interview there? I'm like, well, I have a science background, not a financial background. Like, no, we hire people from all walks. And so I did that, and I wound up becoming an energy market reporter, which sort of, progressed pretty quickly. Bloomberg was a great organization for training you to know what you need to know. And I basically went through a compressed MBA course in about 3 months so that I could then become an expert in the energy markets. And then I left that stupidly when I was in my early 20s, because I really loved riding my bike still. And so then I went to work for a cycling company. And it was at that time that I met John. And John's pathway and mine it wasn't quite a Venn diagram, but it was about as close as two circles could get without overlapping, because he went to university at Penn State and I was in high school in northeastern Pennsylvania, and it's a small rural mountain community. And so you pay very close attention to the sports at Penn State, because it's kind of like another professional set of sports to follow. And so I knew about John. He was a year ahead of me in school. I knew about him when he was at Penn State, and then followed him in the NBA. Didn't really have any connection to him other than that until the Olympics in 2012, where he was doing commentary on one of the basketball games for the BBC. And I wasn't even paying attention to who was talking. All I heard was, "I don't know how you realize that the entire Spanish team is behind you." And it just caught my attention because it was hysterical. You had to see the play for it to make sense. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's John Amaechi. And then I was like, that's right, he's British. And I looked him up and I started following him on Twitter. And this is where our stories diverge, because in his version of the story, he says I was stalking him. Not true. But because I was working at this bike company, he was doing a charity bike ride that followed the Olympic cycling road race route. And he was making some very troubling comments on Twitter about where he was going to get his equipment. And he was threatening to buy cycling clothes on eBay. And I was like, I've got to stop this. And so because I'm a science fiction nerd, I posted a message to him using a picture of HAL 9000 from 2001: A Space Odyssey, just the picture of the red computer eye. And I just put under that, "I can't let you do that, John." Only, a pretty diehard sci-fi nerd would understand that reference. And of course, he is a diehard sci-fi nerd, so he did understand the reference. And he got in touch, and long story short, I helped him out to get some gear for that ride. And as a thank you, he invited me to come down to the NBA game. They used to play an NBA game once a year here in London. And so I actually met him there for the first time. And I don't remember much about that, except that we spent like 3 hours in the same spot, and he would have to go off to do like a photo with somebody or something. And then we would just come back. And so it was almost like instant friendship at that point. And then my career at the bike company started to become rather disenfranchising. And so he was going to help me get a job with the NBA, which was an absolute dream. And then at one point just said, actually, I changed my mind. I think you should just come work with me. And I was like, and we'd been soundboarding stuff that he was trying to develop for a while before that happened. So it's not like he didn't have some idea of what I could do. But the best part about that story is that it is so relevant for what I do now. And I think it's the thing that sort of helped me unlock what my purpose is, because in every job that I had, in every industry that I had before, I would have these experiences with people, some of which were great and some of which just kept making me scratch my head and like, I can't understand. And all that ever did was create questions in my mind about, why is this happening? How do I make it change? What else can I do to prove myself here? Why am I not getting a seat at the table? Why is this person, this manager, only applying one managerial style and not flexing to the different needs of the people? I only ever had questions. So I had like 3 decades worth of questions. And the best thing about John was that he helped me find the answers to those questions. And so what I sort of spun that into is that, the reason why I do what I do now is because I don't want people to have unanswered questions about the things that they're experiencing in workplaces. Because I've been there and I know what it's like to have great leaders, and I know what it's like to have leaders that make you feel like this is I am hurting myself from a well-being standpoint by continuing to expose myself to this environment. And now I know what to do about it. And so I don't want anybody else to have to experience that if they don't have to. And so that was perhaps the greatest gift that I got from John, was that he helped me take an absence of understanding, like I don't know what I'm good at, to helping me understand that my superpower is being able to read an organizational environment like I read a book. And I can see the people that are being impacted in good ways and bad ways by the behaviors that they're experiencing from people. And through being exposed to John and understanding the evidence-based methodology that he uses, I now know how to help people correct those behavioral incivilities that happen and augment the ones that we need to amplify. I don't know if there was an answer to your question in there.
Oh, yeah.
Definitely.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I guess just picking up on a couple of strands there. So there's so many people that may have had sort of really challenged careers and they don't know what good looks like, and they don't know what a constructive environment looks like. What are the kind of cues that you look for that gives you a tell straight away when you read the room and go, yeah, this is a constructive place to be, or this isn't somewhere that, performance or individuals can thrive?
In any meeting setting, there's always the same 2 or 3 people that talk all the time, and you have other people that probably say very little. That's one of the biggest tells for me. And that it can be a big indicator that there is something impacting the psychological safety of the team itself. And don't get me wrong, this is not about seniority. This happens if I'm doing a team session with a C-suite group, 8 to 15 of the most senior people in an organization, the same thing happens there. When you ask executives to rank their own sense of psychological safety, even the most senior people in the room will say that they're not feeling optimally psychologically safe. So who is talking and how frequently they're talking is one of the big tells that I will look for. Another one is, how do more junior people in the team carry themselves if they're in the team environment? And this one is, this one's quite subtle because I'm really introverted, but I'm highly social. So I present myself in a way that I think comes across as being pretty confident. Plus, I'm 6 feet tall, which you can't tell here, but I kind of cast a long shadow, if you know what I mean. And so on the outside, it can look like I'm quite confident, but when I'm interacting with people, there will be something about, I will augment myself in some way. I will edit myself in some way. This is a common concept called code switching, that many Black and brown people who might be listening will be like, yep, I know exactly what that is. We will alter ourselves in some way to make the other person feel more comfortable with our presence. This is something that disproportionately impacts people in traditionally marginalized communities. And so there are very subtle ways that you will see somebody doing that. Like I will shrink myself a little bit if I'm the tallest person in the room. If I go into a meeting room, one of the first things I'm doing is checking to see if there's any other women in there. And if there aren't, then it means I'm probably not going to speak up as much, or I'm instead of making statements, I'm going to ask questions in order to help other people think that it's their genuine idea. And so if I see people doing any of these things, that says a lot to me. How somebody is addressed when a mistake happens is another big one. So if we weaponize mistakes rather than turning them into learning opportunities, that is a huge red flag, and it has far-reaching implications. I bet if I asked each of you to tell me a time when somebody really came down hard on you on a mistake, it probably wasn't something that happened yesterday, but you can probably remember something that happened 10 or 15 years ago, and you can instantly put yourself back in that moment. That is because the way somebody handles a mistake can have absolutely crushing, long-lasting implications on us, and it's a straight line to imposter syndrome from there, and other forms of self-sabotage. So there are things that you can sort of observe, and a lot of it is another basic one that maybe not so much now, but with this constant ridiculous press to get people back in the office 5 days a week, we're probably going to start seeing this again. Who are the people that can't leave until that senior person over there does? Because if I am seen to be leaving before that senior person is, then somehow I'm not trying hard enough. Ridiculous, I know, but this is the whole driver behind getting people back in work is really not about productivity and performance because of the data. It's really about the ego of the people who are saying we should get people back in the office 5 days a week, which is terrible. So those are some of the common things that I see. And a lot of it is just how are people talking about their experience at work? What is the undertone of the way that they're describing their experience? And if I'm doing an assessment, then I'll say, tell me what kinds of things are working well for you here. And then I'll say, what would make your experience even better? And I could have probably written 3 PhDs on the answers to that one question alone, because the moment you give people an opportunity to say, this is what would make my work life better, it just unleashes all of these things. And from that, there are some very common themes that come out of it, one of which I've already mentioned, which is, I just wish my manager had better leadership skills.
We live in such a rich data environment, don't we? But so many people live on autopilot in organizations, don't they? So often when there's external people going in, you just pick up on these things straight away as an external person, don't you? It's almost like, how do you encourage people to take a step outside themselves within their own work environments to understand what is good and what is acceptable and what's not? That's
tough. If I could rephrase the question ever so slightly, I can probably give you a better answer, and I'll explain why. So if we place the burden on the individual to adjust to the environment that they're in, then we're getting it wrong. So if somebody is going to work and just kind of going through the motions, and they're not sort of stepping outside to seek ways to collaborate with people, they're head down, headphones on all the time. A lot of that could just be because, like me, they're an introvert and, they think internally, they don't think out loud. But if that's happening because they're just trying to get by, then we should never place the burden on that individual to adapt to the environment when the problem is the environment itself. And so the rephrasing of the question that I might suggest is, what do we need to understand about the environment that is creating that experience for somebody? And that's probably an easier question to answer because I've touched on a lot of it. It's, I would want to understand from them, is this just a function of you just work better in isolation, and you'll come with great ideas when the time comes? Or are you suppressing yourself in some kind of a social way? You really would like to get to know your colleagues better, but there's something around you that is making you change who you are in order to fit in with the environment. And this is something that a lot of women will understand. Anybody who happens to be a Black or Asian heritage colleague probably understands the same idea. But so does a white guy who doesn't like football. When the conversation on a Monday morning is all about football, and this is a guy who doesn't watch football, how is he supposed to interact in that environment? So he's probably the one that's got his head down, right? And this is why when we talk about inclusion, we are not just talking about people with protected characteristics. Inclusion benefits everybody. And for the record, I would be the woman in the conversation about football, which also really throws people off in lots of ways. So yeah, I'm always really cautious about, what does a person need to do to get through this, when the problem is we shouldn't try and fix the person, we should try to fix the environment. That being said, until the environment gets fixed, there has to be some way for somebody to just kind of survive. And I suppose there's no perfect way to help somebody do that. There's no checklist that you can hand over to somebody. But at a minimum, what you can do is if you're experiencing, fear and anxiety because of behavior, try and identify specifically what behavior it is that is causing that fear and anxiety. Because you may not be able to stop it, but at least you can expect it. And that helps to reduce the fight or flight response in our brain that makes us feel that fear and anxiety. And on the other side, we probably all have at least one or two people that we work with that are sort of in the inner circle of trust, if you will. There's great comfort in being able to share your experiences, good and bad, with the people who are in that inner circle of trust. So continue to rely on them to talk about the experience that you're having, because it can feel quite powerless when you're experiencing non-inclusive behaviors and you just feel like there's nothing that you can do about it. And there are things that you can do about it if you don't feel safe enough to have the conversation with the person who is doing that behavior. Then sometimes a coalition of people, is there safety in numbers, but also is there somebody at peer level that you do have a better relationship that you can talk to about that? But again, these are just like short-term fixes when the real problem is, how is that behavior acceptable in the first place? Who is enabling that? Why are we tolerating it? And that is never the job of the individual to try and to answer. It's the job of the organization, especially people in senior leadership positions.
What do you enjoy most about the work you do? What brings you real joy?
This is weirdly, it's when I know that I'm talking to an organization that really wants to do something. As John would say, it's not just about doing something, it's about doing something effective. So that to me just means that number one, it gives me a little bit of license to say things that I know are not easy for people to hear, because the person on the other side of the conversation is there with me. So the starting point that we're at is the same. And that is hugely satisfying for me, because it's like you're talking to the choir essentially, and you know that they are really receptive to the ideas that you bring forward to them. They really care about the perspective that you have. They rely on the fact that you are coming at this from an evidence-based position. My job in that scenario is to create a psychologically safe engagement for them, so that they can tell me the things that they need to tell me in order for me to do the best job I can for them. So that brings me a huge amount of joy. The other thing that I really love about my job is really just hearing the experiences that people are having, and then being able to say, if I'm doing an assessment, I have to go into a list of questions, and I have to be as sort of agnostic about it as I possibly can. In order to maintain the integrity of the data collection, you have to sort of set your empathy aside in a lot of ways. But the moment that process is finished, the look of relief on somebody's face when I say to them, listen, just so you know, you're not the only one experiencing this. You are not in a vacuum here. I've heard lots of similar things from your colleagues. And I just want you to know that, I can't guarantee that something's going to change, but you may think that this is happening to you. And it is something that a lot of people are experiencing, that even though I'm kind of delivering bad news in a way, it can serve as a bit of a stress reliever for somebody who thinks, am I the only one that sees this, when they're not? And then, of course, when I get feedback about some sort of intervention I've designed where it has really moved the needle for people, it has really had the impact that I believe that it was capable of having, and it has opened up doors for people, that is the ultimate satisfaction, because you want your work to mean something. And when I work with, when all the factors are there that contribute to that, it just means that I can produce things that I know are going to work, and they're going to work because the organization is going to make sure that they do. So that's hugely relieving.
The problem with our work is it can be very deficit focused, can't it? Because that you're kind of drawn to it. So we have to remember it's the process that we find joy in, isn't it? And it's the wins along the way.
Yeah. I mean, if it was always just about the outcomes, I think I would probably be in a much darker place. And sometimes it is just, I really enjoy working with this individual person who's trying to spearhead all of this in the organization. I have just the most amazing clients with just incredibly talented and capable people who are facing the same kind of frustrations. And we can talk about that together. And And even just knowing that they exist and are doing the best that they can is really rewarding. But you're absolutely right. It's we sometimes we live in the bad data. That's I want to make sure that I know what's happening to people that's creating the bad stuff. And as the best line of Pretty Woman is the bad stuff is easier to believe, but it's also where you can make the most difference for people at the same time. So
one of the questions I wanted to ask is, because, even from the first moment you started working in Citibank, like that is a very fast moving organisation, isn't it? And many others, the ones that you work with in Wall Street or wherever, people, it's very much action orientated. To do this work, do you need to slow things down for people? And if so, how do you sort of slow things down to create the space to do this type of work?
So one of the things I'm not very good at is slowing myself down. And especially when somebody gives me a really good idea, I love chasing rabbits down rabbit holes. And so I will immediately go 1,000 miles an hour to try and come up with an answer. And, I've been coached. I am a coach. And so I see this happening in other people and I'm able to recognize it in myself as a result. And the lesson that I take away from that is you really do have to meet people and organizations where they are, which is not always satisfying, right? Because in our work, I don't know if you experience this, but I certainly do. Like, the answer is just completely obvious. And I know it in the first briefing conversation that I have. Oh, I clearly see what it is that you're trying to achieve here. And I have all the answers. And then, you think, okay, this is going to be easy. And it just isn't. It's not just you and the other person on the other end of the phone call. It's layers of people, and you have to sell to the people who are still trying to do the weaponized ignorance thing, and the ones who need to be convinced why we should be doing this and why we should be investing in it. You have to come up with all of these things that only serve as additional challenges, even though the answer is completely obvious. And that's been a really, really hard lesson for me to learn, and one that I probably still struggle to put into practice is meet people where they are. So they're not where they don't have a good set of organizational values. Like, how are you act with integrity? How do you even test that, right? At a minimum, they're there because they want to do something, right? They want to make an improvement, and they're coming to you because they think that you're the person that is able to help them with that. And so has helped me to slow down a little bit. And it means, that's the more direct answer to your question is, I really don't ever have to tell a client to slow down. I'm the one that has to slow down, because they have so many layers of things. A lot of it is bureaucratic layers, internal politics and things that mean that they can't go fast. And they probably have this absolutely terrible narrative about how progress is really slow and we're a super tanker and it takes a long time to, and I wish that people stop believing that, because we know that change can happen really quickly if people want it to. And we've seen lots and lots of examples of how quickly we will make change that has a positive impact overnight, but it takes some sort of catalyst event in order to create the motivation and the ambition to do it. And so for me, it's about slowing me down. It's not about slowing the client down. That being said, what I find myself having to do more often is trying to be diplomatic about swaying people from a path that they're going down that I know won't work, and helping them understand what will. So an easy example of that is reverse mentoring. I do not like the idea of reverse mentoring at all, because in most cases, it winds up having there's more of an emotional burden on the person who is doing the mentoring, who is the more junior person, often the person from a marginalized community. That, like, they are the ones that are doing most of the heavy lifting, and the more senior person is who's supposed to be sponsoring that person and helping them to develop and providing opportunities often doesn't. And so it's an imbalanced relationship that I don't think works well. And yet there's a lot of organizations that still are pursuing reverse mentoring programs. And I'm not saying that 100% of the time they don't work. They just have to be structured in very specific ways. Mentoring and coaching is a contractual relationship. And a lot of times they're not implemented in ways that maintain the integrity of that contractual relationship. And so I find myself having to do more of that, saying, I see what you're trying to achieve. Here's what I think you should know about that kind of program. And from an evidence-based position, this is the thing that is much more effective because it's based on actual behavior change techniques and not satisfying some group of people that says, we just need to get some more women up in here.
If you look back at your career, what would some of the kind of two or three of the biggest lessons you've learned so far that you kind of carry with you and inform the work you do?
I think the first one is that it would be so much better if when you come out of school and you get your first job, you're tunnel visioned into this is my job. And if you happen to be working in an organization of any particular size, there isn't enough that teaches you what's the lay of the land? What are the unwritten rules? How do people get noticed here? What kinds of characteristics do people look for when it comes to progression? And make no mistake, a lot of these things are dysfunctional, right? Because again, if you operated in a psychologically safe environment, then on day one, your manager would be saying, here's what you need to know. This is a psychologically safe environment. Here's what that means. Here's what it doesn't mean. We need you to speak up in order to help us come up with whatever it is that we're trying to achieve here. And that doesn't happen enough. But then also what doesn't happen is, here's how pay banding works. Here's how you can get access to mentorship opportunities. Here's how you can get access to coaching or sponsorship. Here's how you can identify ways that you might want to get into a stretch assignment. It's just, here's your job description. Here's this box that you live in. And all this other stuff exists in the organization. And not enough is done to tell you about those things, the good things and the bad things. So I think that's one of the biggest lessons that I took away, is that you don't learn about that stuff until it's way later in your career. And in fact, with one of my clients, we're developing a program where we match them with a senior leader. And one of their responsibilities as a senior leader is to say, hey, do you know how pay banding works? Do you know what your pay band is? And do you know what the next one is above it? And so there's onboarding processes, but then there's onboarding processes are like compliance stuff, right? It's health and safety. It's here's our code of conduct. Here's what you do if you have a grievance that you need to file. You're going to get paid at the end of every month, that's what onboarding is in organizations. And none of the onboarding stuff that I've come across does any of that factor in what you need to understand about the organization's culture. And I think that would have been such a game changer for me personally when I was first starting out. Like if somebody had, when I went to work at Bloomberg, if somebody had said to me, hey, this place has got you're going to get all the free food that you want. You're probably going to gain 15 pounds in the first year that you work here because there's food everywhere and that's amazing. But here's what you need to know about how the culture of this organization works and how you can find your place in it. If somebody had said that to me, I might have stayed for a lot longer than I did. So that's one lesson. The other lesson is, this is another thing that I realized after I got to know John a little bit, since we both had this team sports background, and believe me, I'm not putting myself on the same playing field as John, right? He was a pro, but we both grew up in the narrative that look what team sports can teach you. And like him, I've been on really amazing teams, both in sporting environments and also in workplace environments. And you can still be incredibly disappointed in those environments because of the behaviors that you experience. So it's less about the participation that teaches you the lesson, and more about who is creating that environment in which you are participating. And so if you have a great coach, like my 8th grade basketball coach was terrible. She hated me because I moved into the area. There were 3 people on the team that were family members of hers. I was the outsider. I was 6 feet tall, and I also happened to be pretty good. And you'd think that that'd be a good thing, right? She did not like me. And in U.S. schools set up, you go to junior high school, and then you go to high school after that at the age of 13 or 14. And the middle school that I was in was next to the high school across the car park. So the high school coach would come over and watch the 8th grade games because that was the team that he was inheriting the next year. And he came up to me after one game where I had scored, a lot of points. She was on me like the whole game. Talk about weaponizing mistakes. No matter how many points I scored, anything that I did wrong, there was just an exponentially larger response from her to that. And he came up to me after this game and he said, listen, I just want you to know that I see everything that's happening to you here. and you're going to have a very different experience when you come across the parking lot next year. I was 13 years old, and I remember everything about that interaction. I can tell you where my parents were standing. I can tell you where he was standing. I can tell you how he was standing. And I remember the words that he said. And that's a number of years ago that I don't really want to admit, but let's just say it's several decades ago. And so it's about those individual experiences that you have. And sometimes we don't pay enough attention to those good relationships. And that means that the bad relationships in those settings often have a disproportionate impact on us and can last a really long time. Because I remember what my 8th grade coach did to me. But as I started to think about that story and how it applies to what I do now, I remember way more about Coach Coslett and what he said to me than I did about the name of my 8th grade coach. I don't even remember. But for a lot of people, it's the other way around. And so I suppose that I'm not sure that there is a real lesson in that other than pay attention to the relationships that are making you feel positive things about the environment that you're in, and really pay attention to the relationships that are making you feel the negative things, because the more you can understand about why those behaviors are impacting you, the more agency you might have over your own response. That was a really long second lesson.
A very worthy lesson as well. We'll take that. It's so important. It's also the power of moments as well, isn't it? And how they can shape lives. And even if something really bad happens, there's always something that a leader can do to help the person get through that particular experience that they've had as well. How do you invest in your own learning and development? You come across as someone who's really well read and really across the evidence base and understanding how organizations work. How do you keep that learning moving and progressing for you?
I'm just a nerd. I am really curious about everything, and I just get really cranky that I don't have enough time to learn everything about everything. But at the same time, I want to be good at my job. I want to be exceptional at my job. And so there comes with that a responsibility to pay attention to what's happening in contemporary behavioral science and to really understand what the evidence is telling us, and to be able to turn, really academic sounding language into accessible ideas that people can relate to and can make sense of. And I think that's probably the thing that drives my own education about this, is that I want to be able to take ideas that people should know, but nobody wants to read a 35-page academic publication on, the minutia of how a specific behavior impacts one specific aspect of performance. I want to read that, but I want to read it because I'm guessing that there's something in there that's going to provide value to the person that I am talking to. And so I want to be the translator. I want to say, what all I need you to understand is that I am doing the work of looking at the evidence, but I'm doing that so that I can present the information to you in a way that makes sense. And that really is a big motivator for me in terms of how I continue to learn stuff. And like my dad, I probably, when I read, it's mostly nonfiction. And so I kind of, it's not that it's fun. Sometimes it is, like reading Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman was not fun. I mean, that is a labor-intensive book.
They're quite dense books by Daniel Kahneman, aren't they?
And let me tell you, I've done both the book and the audiobook, and the audiobook is not better. It is not better.
I think I have it half listened to on my iPhone.
And now I find that it's great to fall asleep to. But there's so much gold in there that if more people knew about it, the world literally would be a better place. And so I use that as sort of the driver behind why I spend time reading more nonfiction instead of diving into the complete collection of Murakami, because I really like Murakami books and all science fiction, obviously. That's how I keep myself motivated, I think, because I see it as a responsibility of my job. But then I like to learn about stuff that is completely outside of my field. Like all of my friends know I'm a bird nerd, to the point where one of them even got me a T-shirt that says "bird nerd." And I'm not a twitcher. I don't even have a set of binoculars. I don't go out into the countryside and marvel at the wagtail. But because I live in central London, but I do have bird feeders that are right outside of this window. And the whole time we have been talking here, I've had Indian ringneck parrots and goldfinches and at least one blue tit. And so, I have this curiosity that makes me go and learn about stuff that doesn't really apply to anything. And I think there's a lesson in that too, which is that anybody who is a fan of Ted Lasso, one of the absolute best scenes of what was an incredibly amazing show was the scene where he's playing darts with Rupert, and he talks about the dangers of incuriosity. And if only somebody had bothered to ask, he would realize that he's not actually left-handed, and he switches to his right hand. And a very similar moment in The Princess Bride, by the way. So I think that incuriosity has created so many problems that we are now trying to deal with, not just organizationally, but also socially. And I just don't want to be that person. I don't ever want to be incurious.
Maybe a difficult question. Is there a particular book or podcast you recommend? Is there one that you find yourself recommending to people?
I'm a really big fan of the Pivot podcast, which is Kara Swisher and Scott Galloway. They kind of come at it from they both have tech backgrounds, but they also, what they talk about crosses over a lot into the stuff that I do, because they will look at, Mark Zuckerberg's latest behavior, and they will talk about the implications that has on people that work at Meta, and of course beyond, because of the size of the platform that Meta has. So even though they tend to focus a lot on topics related to technology, they don't limit their conversation to just the sort of nerdy techie part of it. They will wind up crossing over a lot into what are the implications of this on individual people and on organizations. So I really like that one. There's a guy called W. Kamau Bell who's based in the US. He's got a couple of different kinds of podcasts. He's a really great educator. He talks a lot about the Black perspective, which I really value as well. And other than that, I don't listen to a lot of podcasts. A friend put me onto one that's financial, because I need to really get serious about my retirement. And so I've been listening to that one. But yeah, I have to say, I want to be a person that just consumes podcasts like they're going out of style. And I just am not that person, and that bothers me.
You've had such an interesting career to date. What advice would you give someone who's considering or is just beginning a career in organization development in the field?
Dive into the science. Behavioral science is real. There's so much to learn about it. It helps you understand how you walk through the world in both a personal and a professional capacity. And at the same time, it comes with a lot of occupational hazards. For example, the moment that you start to learn about bias, you see it everywhere, and it's infuriating. But it's also learning about something like bias just helps make so much sense of things. And at least I think when you get into the behavioral science, it actually almost makes it easier for you to manage the array of behaviors that you will see for people. It never really reduces the sting of bad behavior, but at least you can see it for what it is. And I think that's, again, a thing that nobody teaches you about when you first start your professional career is, if you experience behavior that makes you feel a kind of way and your spider sense starts to tingle, don't ignore that. So I think for anybody that wants to get into this business, you've got to go into it from a behavioral science perspective. There are lots of people who label themselves as life coaches, and I'm just not sure. I'm sure that there are amazing, well-educated, evidence-grounded life coaches that are out there, but I've not met one yet. And having gone through a coaching qualification, I know exactly how difficult it is to become a coach and what that involves. And it's all because of the science bit. So this is a tremendously wonderful profession to be in. It is not without its frustrations and its pitfalls. It is not without its sense that sometimes you're just not being listened to. But the things that it can unlock for us as individuals when we learn about these things is, it can be life-changing in terms of your awareness of the world and how to process the world that you live in. But then especially when you have somebody who values that information to try and make their own workplace better, it's hugely, hugely rewarding. So yeah, behavioral science. And I mean, I'm a disciple of Susan Michie at UCL. Yeah. She's the the woman of behavioral science when it comes to behavior change techniques. She has a wonderful app that has all of her categorized behavior change techniques in it. Amy Edmondson at Harvard Business School is our contemporary leader when it comes to understanding psychological safety, particularly as it applies to workplace settings. Adam Grant is pretty much good at whatever he talks about. And then, of course, Daniel Kahneman is who my absolute go-to for anything relating to bias. And then there's a couple of other people. One is Dr. Claude Steele, who wrote a book called Whistling Vivaldi, which is all about stereotype bias and stereotype threat, which I think should be required reading in schools. It's that good, it's that accessible, and it's that profound when you read it. And then his research opened up a lot of doors, one of whom was another professor by the name of Dr. Daryl DeWing Su, who is at Columbia, who is the person who has really expanded our understanding of microaggressions and broadened the array of microaggressions that we know exist in the world. If you look up any of those people, and that's an incomplete list, of course, but that's a really good starting point for anybody that has any interest in doing this sort of organizational consultancy or organizational psychology, or wants to have a focus on leadership and leadership development and how organizational cultures work. If you focused on that list of available resources, I think you'd be pretty far on the way to having a good grounding for this line of work.
Brilliant. Well, I just want to say a huge thank you, Chris. At the beginning, I promised that you would be compelling and insightful, and you've absolutely fulfilled that promise. So thank you. It's been a really, really engaging conversation, and there's just so much value, so much experience you shared, and some brilliant references for people to go and pursue as well. Danny, what stood out for you from this conversation?
Could be here a long time, but I think going right back to what you said at the beginning about really understanding the difference between people being engaged and thriving, and there's a real differential between that. I think you gave some really practical advice, particularly about kind of delivering difficult news to leaders and how to pitch that. And then I think the importance of meeting people and organisations where they are, so important in the work that we do.
One thing that I forgot to mention, and I don't know if you can edit this in or something, but have either of you ever read Gallup's State of the Global Workplace report? They produce it every year, and it is devastating. I mean, it's incredibly beneficial for anybody who is in the line of organizational consultancy, but it is a comprehensive report that is broken down region by region, and it shows effectively the level of despair that exists in workplaces around the world. It is a rich and comprehensive body of evidence that really showcases just how much work there is to be done to improve the experience that people are having in organizations. I probably refer to it once a week at least, and have only just scratched, there's so much data in there that you could spend a good 2 or 3 days trying to absorb it all, but it's incredibly relevant and also shows the magnitude of the problem. So that's another resource I would recommend, Gallup's State of the Global Workplace Report. It's free. Gallup, they do lots of really amazing research, but that one is, every time it comes out, I'm just like, oh man, here we go. Oh yeah, nothing has changed, or oh yeah, it's gotten worse.
Brilliant. And if people want to follow your work, or if they're really curious about the work that you do and they'd like to engage you and discuss the work that you do and potentially explore working with you as well, what is the best way for people to follow you?
I've got a shiny website that you can find at culturegen.com. Culturegen is an actual word. It's CULTURGEN, doesn't have an E after culture. It's actually a fascinating word. So culturegen.com is a good place to start, so you can sort of see what my portfolio of services are. I'm available on LinkedIn. I'm not good at it, but I at least check for messages. Or you can just email me on chris@culturegen.com if you want to have a conversation about stuff. Tell me what you need. I'll tell you if I can help. If I can't help, I'll try and figure out who can.
Brilliant. And all of those links and contact details that Chris has shared are going to be in the show notes, whether you're looking at watching this on YouTube or whether you're on Buzzsprout or one of the audio platforms. That'll all be there for you as well. Chris, I want to say a huge thank you. It's been really, really good. It's been such an interesting conversation, and I know we've got so much out of it. If you're watching this and you know someone who regularly deploys weaponized ignorance in the workplace and you think that they would benefit from learning more about bias and how they can work with engagement or disengagement in the workplace, then please share this podcast with them. There's no better way than actually just delving into it. Or if you just want to have people understand more about behavioural science and everything else that happens in Chris's field, please share this. And also, if you've liked it, please subscribe and like to the channel as well. But most importantly, thank you so much, Chris. It's been really, really good. We've really enjoyed it. And we really appreciate all your time as well. So thank you.
Loved it. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.